If this is the upside down, then it means this is also the upside down, right? Well, not exactly. The two places I'm showing you on the screen right now are entirely different, and in today's video, I'm going to explain everything you need to know about how the upside down world was created, what Dimension X is, and most importantly, the reason most of you clicked on my video. I'll explain how Henry, aka Vecna, got his powers. So be sure to stay until the end, because we're going to dive deep into the lore of Stranger Things. And trust me, you need to know this stuff before the season finale premieres. Most of the information I'm going to share comes from the Broadway play The First Shadow, which the Duffer Brothers confirmed is canon. I don't really understand why they didn't release the play on Netflix as well, since it contains critical information about the lore of Stranger Things, but I'm guessing this will be a major focus in Season 5. I'll also include links to the Stranger Things wiki, where you can find all this information and read more on the subject. To get started, we need to take a trip into the past, back to 1943, where everything began with a secret US government experiment known as Project Rainbow. Yes, Rainbow, as in the Rainbow Room we would later see Elle and Kaylee in at the Hawkins lab. The interesting part about this project is that the US government actually attempted a similar experiment in real life, which you may have heard of at least once, the Philadelphia experiment. Just like in the real experiment, the goal was to make the ship USS Eldridge invisible and able to pass through German radar. In 1943, an experimental device aboard the ship was activated, but instead of becoming invisible, the ship was teleported to Dimension X, the same dimension where Henry would later be transported by a young 11. After the ship returned, all crew members were killed by Demogorgons, with the exception of one survivor, Captain Brenner, Martin Brenner's father. The captain suffered severe injuries, and the Navy couldn't treat him because his body refused any blood transfusions. Tests revealed that his time in Dimension X had infected him with particles that altered his blood type. The only person he confided in about his experience was his son, Martin Brenner, sparking the young boy's fascination. Martin made it his life mission to recreate the experiment and achieve the world his father had described. His perseverance was rewarded, and sometime in the 1950s, Martin Brenner was put in charge of the Nevada experiment, a project aimed at replicating what happened with the USS Eldridge. However, a rogue staff member defected and stole essential equipment from Brenner, hiding it in a nearby cave system. This is where a young Henry Creel comes into the story. Henry's family lived in Nevada at the time, and he was a small child with a passion for cave exploration. One day, while exploring the caves with his spyglass, he stumbled across the stolen scientific equipment. The technology unexpectedly activated, transporting both Henry and the rogue staff member to Dimension X, and killing the staff member in the process. In this alternate world, Henry glimpsed strange creatures, the Demogorgons, and came under the influence of a shadowy entity, the Mind Flayer. After 12 hours, Henry eventually returned home with altered blood and a changed personality. Although nothing is official yet, we can say with near certainty that this is where his powers originated. The exposure he experienced in Dimension X combined with the influence of the Mind Flayer granted him his telekinetic abilities. Brenner later recovered the stolen equipment, including the spyglass belonging to Henry. Using the spyglass as a clue, Brenner eventually tracked down Henry and made him the first in a new series of test subjects at Hawkins' lab. This is interesting because it somewhat contradicts what we initially saw in the series. Henry disclosed that he was always special and that it seemed like he always had powers. He didn't recall his encounter with the Mind Flayer as a child and only mentions meeting it after 11 teleported him to Dimension X. So I'm really curious to see the explanation we'll get in Season 5. Which version is correct? Is Henry's version of events true, or did his mind block that horrific memory to protect him, similar to how 11 forgot how to use her powers? Another interesting theory is that Henry was actually possessed by the Mind Flayer here and there, which is why he gained powers and his personality changed when he returned to the real world. In short, this is where Dimension X was first mentioned and how Vecna got his powers. But you might be wondering about the connection between Dimension X and the Upside Down. To understand that connection, you need to know this history. Stick with me, because I'm going to make this as simple as possible. There are 3 things we need to talk about: the Upside Down, Dimension X, and the Hellscape. In short, the Upside Down and Dimension X are 2 entirely different dimensions. while the Hellscape is the space between dimensions, including the right side up. Think of the Hellscape as the place that holds everything together. This is the place where we see Henry falling and getting struck by lightning. You can see what I'm referring to as the space between two dimensions, one on the right and one on the left. The Hellscape's role is to be the guardian between those dimensions, preventing anything from passing through. So how did Henry manage to arrive in Dimension X if that gatekeeper stops everything? We can only speculate, but part of the reason likely has to do with his prior exposure to Dimension X. When Henry and Eleven battle in the lab, and Henry is ultimately defeated, what we see Eleven doing is not killing him. It's teleporting him into the Hellscape. Eleven used her immense telekinetic power to open a portal through which Henry fell into the Hellscape. The lightning we saw was the portal opening, and the disintegrated particles were Henry being absorbed and transported into the Hellscape. Now, what I'm about to share is just my own theory on how Henry survived this. Everything I've said so far is canon, confirmed by multiple sources. Eleven is responsible for sending him in the Hellscape, but the reason he ended up in Dimension X is because of the Mind Flayer. Hear me out. If Eleven can open a portal from her world to the Hellscape, and her powers come from Henry, and Henry's powers come from the Mind Flayer, then it's logical to assume that the Mind Flayer could also create portals between its world, Dimension X, and the Hellscape. One of these portals is likely how Henry escaped the Hellscape. I believe this is possible because the Mind Flayer already infected Henry with some of its particles. We know about the hive mentality and how all its creatures are interconnected, which means the Mind Flayer and Henry are linked as well. The Mind Flayer would know Henry was in the Hellscape, which is how it could open a portal to save him. This is how Henry arrived in Dimension X. This post-apocalyptic world is the original home of the Demogorgons, the vines, those odd bats, and everything else we saw in the Upside Down. Just look at how deserted it is. There is no water in sight, which explains why it's one of their weaknesses. Dimension X is also the home of the Mind Flayer, which we see as those floating particles. In the show, Henry explains that after being banished to this world and wandering through it lost, he discovered something incredible. A mass of particles which he modeled it into a giant spider. Using those particles, he was able to achieve his long-desired goal, to rid the planet of the pests that humans are. But the version we get from the Broadway play reveals something even more interesting. Henry isn't actually controlling the Mind Flayer. It's the other way around. Honestly, this makes a lot more sense. Remember, Henry was already exposed to those particles as a child, and when he returned from Dimension X, his view of the world had completely changed. This is why I think it was actually the Mind Flayer who came back from Dimension X, not Henry. Only a small portion of the Mind Flayer's power managed to return, so he didn't yet have enough to complete his plan of conquering another planet and reshaping it like Dimension X. Will was possessed in the same way Henry was. Remember what Will said about the Mind Flayer? He said it's always there, but it chooses not to take control unless it's important. Otherwise, it stays dormant and lets Will think he has control over his body. We saw the truth when Will was captured and exposed to intense heat. The switch immediately flipped and the Mind Flayer took over. I believe the same happens with Henry. He thinks he's controlling the Mind Flayer, but in reality, the Mind Flayer is the mastermind, running everything from behind the scenes. So, in short, Dimension X is this deserted post-apocalyptic world with floating rocks, and it's the home of the Demogorgons, the vines, and the Mind Flayer's particles. But what about the Upside Down, and how does it connect to everything I've shared so far? As I said, the Upside Down is an entirely different dimension, created on November 6, 1983, the moment Eleven touched the Demogorgon in the void. At that moment, the Demogorgon was in Dimension X, and Eleven was in the real world. When Eleven made physical contact with it, the two dimensions overlapped, creating a new, separate dimension that contained elements from both worlds. Essentially, it created a snapshot of Hawkins at the exact moment of the touch. This is why Nancy said the Upside Down was frozen on the day Will disappeared. It wasn't frozen, it was created that day, perfectly replicating Hawkins at that exact time. I know this isn't the clearest diagram to explain it, but I hope this visual representation I created helps you understand it a bit better. The Upside Down is essentially the meeting point between the two worlds. Hopefully everything is clear so far. Stick with me, because we're almost at the finish line. Eleven created the Upside Down by touching the Demogorgon, but how was she able to encounter such a strange creature in the first place? And this is why you need to know all the history I shared at the beginning of this video. The answer is Martin Brenner. He is the mastermind and the reason all of this happened. Remember Brenner's lifelong goal? It was to reach the dimension his father told him about. When he arrived in the room where Eleven had teleported Henry into the Hellscape, Brenner realized what had happened. Deep down, he always hoped his theory was correct, that Henry was still alive somewhere, hopefully in that dimension his father had described. This is why he sent Eleven on all those reconnaissance missions. The official explanation was that she needed to spy on the Russians, but the real reason was much deeper. Brenner secretly hoped that while Eleven was in the void, she might encounter Henry. Or perhaps Henry could find a way to communicate with her. Brenner knew his subjects were capable of such feats because of the rigorous training they underwent. So when he heard Eleven talking about a strange creature and an unusual noise, he immediately encouraged her to face the monster instead of running from it. Brenner knew that if Henry was alive, Eleven's time in the void would be the only way to reach him. And when he heard about the monster, he recognized it as being connected to Henry and Dimension X, thanks to his prior knowledge of the place and what his father had told him. This is why Eleven decided to approach the strange monster. When she finally made contact, she created the portal that started everything. By making physical contact, the two dimensions directly interacted, bypassing the Hellscape and allowing a direct portal to be opened between them. I hope I've explained this in a way that makes sense. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask in the comments. I'll do my best to answer all of them. It's honestly kind of disappointing that the Broadway play isn't available on Netflix because, as you saw, it contains a lot of valuable information about the world of Stranger Things. But maybe this material will be the focus of Season 5, and they didn't want to spoil it. What do you think about that? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel. It really helps me create more awesome content like this.